Okay, so just a little bit of a recap of the various kinds of uh, alternative sort of critical lenses to looking at modernity that we have covered. We looked at the idea of the apocalypse, meaning, history, dream, context, vernacular, and today we are looking at a very important aspect that has been critical in really challenging uh, the ideas of modernity, and that is the idea of the everyday. Yeah. Uh, give you a little bit of a context. One of the sort of first kind of critique of everyday life came from a French philosopher named Henri Lefebvre. Yeah, and his entire body of work actually is what is called uh, uh, critical sort of a Marxist theory, as well as he critiques the state of the modern kind of life. Yeah, and what are the kinds of anomalies that it creates. Okay, there's a three-part volume. It's called the Critique of Everyday Life that he has written. That came uh, at different progressions. So the first one was in 1947, the second in 1961, and third is in 1977. Very clearly, the period that we have been actually looking at in this particular course. Yeah, I'm going to do some small amount of reading from one of these volumes. Just hold on. Okay, so here's in I think the volume number 1 where he gives a kind of a background to what this kind of shift of the everyday life has been in this kind of modern context. So he says, this is how he says it. He says, how many times have we all strolled through the French countryside without knowing how to decipher the human landscape before our eyes? Yeah, we look with the eyes of unskilled aesthetes who confuse natural facts with human facts, who observe the product of human actions, the face that 100 centuries of working the soil have given to our land, as though it were the sea or the sky, where the wake of man's passage quickly fades away. We do not know how to see this reality, so near and so vast. These forms creative labor has produced. Yeah, so he says that this is actually not something which is pastoral or this kind of idea that is there in the kind of idea of nature. You know, it is actually something that is created out of what he calls creative labor. Yeah, forms of creative labor. City dwellers getting away from it all, intellectuals at a loose end, we wandered through the French countryside simply for something to do. We look, but we are unable to see. We are caught in a hybrid compromise between aesthetic spectacle and knowledge. When the flight of a bird catches our attention, or the mooing of a cow, or a shepherd boy singing, we think we are being very clever and very concrete, but we are unable to seize the human facts. Yeah, we fail to see them where they are, namely in humble, familiar, everyday objects, the shape of fields, of plows. Our search for human takes us too far, too deep. We seek it in the clouds or in the mysteries, whereas it is waiting for us, besieging us on all sides. Yeah. Uh, Very interesting to read this. Huh? We will not find it in myths, although human facts carry with them a long and magnificent procession of legends, tales, and songs and poems and dances. All we need to do is simply open our eyes to leave the dark world of metaphysics and the false depths of our inner life behind, and we will discover the immense human wealth that the humblest facts of everyday life contain. Yeah. The familiar is not necessarily known, as said Hegel. Let us go farther and say that it is in the most familiar things that the unknown, not the mysterious, is at its richest, and that this rich content of life is still beyond our empty, darkling consciousness, inhabited as it is by impostors and gorged with the forms of pure reason, with myth and their illusionary poetry. Yeah. So he begs us to actually look at the small, everyday things that are happening around our life, and he insists that actually it is there where we might be able to actually find the truths that we are seeking. It is in this material existence. It is in this kind of way in which we sort of uh, we sort of work in the way we interact with each other, in the way we share things with each other, where we might be able to find some of the truths that we are seeking, some of the truths that we have been troubled with. Yeah. In a later form, he also wrote, before the third volume came, he also wrote another piece which was called Everyday Life in the Modern World. And I'm going to read out two small excerpts from this particular book. It's there in the library. The critique of the first three volumes, I don't think are there in the library, but we have soft copies amongst us somewhere. Yeah. So he says everyday life.
And I have hard copies at home.
Oh, you have all three of them.
All three.
Okay, great. He says everyday life is a crust of earth over the tunnels and caves of unconscious, and against a skyline of uncertainty and illusion that we call modernity. Okay. So he very clearly says that the reality is here in the everyday, that illusion of modernity on which it sits. While overhead stretch the heavens of permanence, amongst the greater planets are scientificness, clear, cold, and somewhat shadowy, and the twin planets, virility and femininity. Yeah. There are stars, constellation, and nebulae. High over the polar horizons, we find technology, and elsewhere youthfulness. There are no such as reliability, frozen extinct stars like beauty, and the strange signs of eroticism. Amongst the fixed stars of the first magnitude, we might place urbanism and urbanization, so long as we do not omit naturalness, rationality, and few others. And then the sublunar planets, fashion, okay, allocatable in the vicinity of femininity and sportiveness, etc. I found this very, very exciting to read. Yeah. In the introduction to the Everyday Life in Modern World, Philip Wander gives another very interesting sort of description. He says that the modern world fosters a childlike personality, a person who constantly seeks and needs approval, who is not hung up on the past and is not committed to a future apart from becoming a success. Yeah. It fosters a person who enters into the here and now of adjustment demanded by bosses and customers, who has no principles to speak of, who remains ever alert for opportunities, knowing that they may never knock again. Aimless, overreactive, inconsistent, face aching at the end of the day from the ever present and required smile, the marketing persona is of a piece with the modern world. Yeah. Okay. So, so very clearly, in the introduction, Wander establishes the nature of this modern persona that exists in this modern world, subjected into this perpetual kind of state of uh, need to perform and a need for spectacle. Yeah. uh, the same kind of a critique and rhetoric we will find in the next few slides as well, and I'm going to try and sketch out some of the movements that are taking shape under this kind of idea. Yeah. One of the first movements that I'm going to talk about is called letterism. Okay. The movement has its theoretical roots in Dada and Surrealism. We had spoken about Dada and Surrealism in our earlier series of lectures. It's established in 1946 by a Polish who's, I think, is Isidore Isou and Gabriel Pomeran. Yeah. Uh, in French, the movement is called letterism, for the French word letter, arising from the fact that many of their early works centered on letters and on other visual or spoken symbols. Okay. Letterism established a few kinds of what do you say, methods of actually analyzing works of arts, fundamentally coming from poetry, but also then looking at other works of arts like graphics, as well as film and film cinema, etc. Yeah. Two of their methods are called the Amplique and the chiseling, and they term them as the phases. Yeah. So Izo first invented these phases through an examination of the history of poetry. But the conceptual apparatus he developed could very well be applied on all branches. In poetry, he felt that the first amplic phase had been initiated by Homer. In effect, Homer set out a blueprint for what a poem ought to be like. Subsequent poets then developed this blueprint, investigating by means of their work all the different things that could be done within the Homeric parameters. Letterism chose to actually sort of extend the amplic and chiseling phases beyond the Homeric parameters. Yeah. So these are some of the kinds of artworks that came out of this letterist movement. When I was looking at them, they actually appeared like the kind of things that we hold in our that we hold in our processes, in our diaries, and things like that. The left-hand side one is called The Scoundrels by a guy named Maurice Lemaitre, and the right hand side one is called Numbers by Isidore Isou. Yeah. So these are the ways in which text along with graphic in many ways a kind of a what do you say a graphic kind of graphic novel extensions maybe with certain amount of typography emerges under this letterist movement. Okay. One of the most important techniques that the letterist method evolved is what is called hypergraphics or metagraphics. And this one I found very interesting. This is actually built under the Situationist International, but I'm putting it over here just to make it just to make a point that it is in fact in the letterist traditions that these were actually invented. Okay, so this method was based on merging poetry and graphics, combining text and visual ways of communication. The technique was originally developed by letterists, and then it was taken on by others who were part of the Situationist International. I'm going to just keep this over here, and we have to imagine post-war Europe in this kind of reconstructive mode, where a lot of capital has been received from America as for reconstruction purposes, and there is a certain way in which life gets restructured after the war. Okay, there is a certain way in which and we have seen so many of in earlier lectures where, for example, the Siam discourses happened, the kind of ways in which cities were imagined, the way the homes were imagined. Everybody was now starting to get placed in a certain way within a certain framework. So if you had to work over here, you had to live over there, and this is where you went for your leisure. Okay, so those are the ways in which life is getting reorganized, and a lot of the resistance is coming from this way in which this reorganization of life is taking form. Yeah. Okay, some more of the kind of hypergraphics or metagraphics. On the left hand side is a poster for a cinema collection called Off Screen Cinema. It has the letterist sort of avant-garde cinema support, and on the right hand side is also another kind of a poster for letterist cinema. It's I'm reading the top line. It says, "We support everything since the dawn of time that has struggled and still struggles." Okay, so there is a lot of there's a lot of I mean, in some way, poetic kind of sort of probing, using the image and graphic to your advantage. Yeah. Okay, something happens within the letterist traditions that creates a schism in this, and it is in this schism that a new group of people emerge from the letterists called the Situationists, and it is actually in one of the sort of not conferences, but I think launch of a cinema by Charlie Chaplin at the Ritz, where a group of letterists go in and distribute certain pamphlets to all the people over there. The left hand side is the is that pamphlet which says no more flat fee, and it tells Charlie Chaplin to go back. Okay. So while the Letters International was created by by many, including someone named Guy Debord. Okay, uh, there was this schism created by Guy Debord himself. Yeah, uh, this was the first sort of breakaway faction from Isidore Isu's letterist. It developed when the left wing of the letterist group disrupted. I'm reading it again. A Charlie Chaplin event in Paris. They distributed a polemic entitled "No More Flat Feet," which concluded the footlights have melted the makeup of the supposedly brilliant mime. All we can see now is a lugubrious and mercenary old man. Go home, Mr. Chaplin. Uh, whereas whereas the chief founder of Letterist, Iso, was keen to distance himself from his younger acolytes track. His own attitude was that Chaplin deserved respect as one of the greatest creators of cinematic art. The breakaway group felt that he was no longer relevant, and they turned Iso's own words back at him. We appreciate the importance of Chaplin's work in his own time, but we know that today novelty lies elsewhere, and truths which no longer entertain become lies. As they proceeded to explain, the most urgent exercise of liberty is destruction of idols. Yeah. So the Situationist International actually emerges as a schism from the letterists. The key proponent of the Situationist sort of group is this guy named guy named Debord. Yeah. The term situationist refers to the construction of situations. One of the early central concepts of the Situationist International. The theory sees the situation as a tool for liberation of everyday life, a method of negating the pervasive alienation that accompanied the spectacle. Yeah, the fact that the spectacle is happening, and you are just a kind of a passive sort of a consumer, is what this condition of alienation seems to have been in this particular context. Yeah, the situation is argued that advanced capitalism manufactured false desires, literally in the sense of ubiquitous advertising and the glorification of accumulated capital, and more broadly in the abstraction and reification of more ephemeral experiences of authentic life into commodities. Okay, this is very important to understand. The idea of the authentic life as presented to us as commodities to again consume. Yeah, and we find that in today's day and context, of course, it holds very true in India as well, or in across the world actually. The experimental direction of situationist activity consisted of setting up temporary environments favorable to the fulfillment of true and authentic human desires in response. Okay, there are two. Yeah, okay. I'm going to read out some parts of their manifesto, which are also very exciting. There's a book in the library called Manifestos of the 21st Century. Uh, Architecture Manifestos of the 21st Century, I think that's what it's called. And it has a collection of around about 50-60 manifesto. The Situationist Manifesto is a part of that collection. So somewhere in the manifesto, it's just a small 2-page read. It says, what are the prospects for organization of life in a society which genuinely will recognize production on the foundation of a free and equal association of producers? Automation of production and socialization of essential goods will increasingly reduce work as an external necessity and will finally give the individual complete freedom. Thus, freed from all economic responsibility, freed from all his debts and guilt towards the past and other people, man will dispose of a few surplus value, impossible to calculate in money terms because it cannot be reduced to the measurement of paid work. Value of play, the life freely constructed. The exercise of this playful creativity is the guarantee of the freedom of each and all within the framework of that equality, which is guaranteed by the absence of exploitation of one man by other. Okay, so in the sort of extended future from there, they imagine that if all work has to be mechanized and done by machines, there is a certain kind of what is called labor or play which is now available. Okay, the freedom to play means man's creative autonomy, which goes beyond the old divisions between imposed work and passive leisure. Their fundamental sort of grudge comes from this idea of imposed work and passive leisure. Yeah. So very clearly stating some of the kind of disagreements with the way life is getting restructured. Uh, in terms of the for architecture, Guy Debord actually has this to say. He says unitary town planning is defined first through the application of the totality of arts and technologies and and partnered forces in an integral composition of the environment. Very similar to what the Bauhaus also was actually insisting, yeah, that art, technologies, and everything sort of comes together in order to form the idea of architecture. Further, the spelling is wrong. Unitary town planning is dynamic. That is to say, in close relationship with lifestyle and behavior. Okay, but he adds this. He says, but unitary town planning is much more dynamic than just the consolidation. It requires to respond to lifestyle and behavior. The element to which everything is ultimately reduced, he says, is not the house, but the architectonic complex, which is the unification of all those factors that determine an environment or a series of impinging environment. And he begs that architecture must advance by taking as its subject existing situations rather than existing forms. Okay, so he makes a case for architecture as not just simply purely formal, okay, sort of objects that are actually built, but in fact that architecture also has to respond to what happens, how it can work with situations and conditions. Yeah. Okay, two very important methods that the that the situationists actually give us. One is called the derive. Yeah, so derive is what he defines as a mode of experimental behavior linked to the conditions of urban society and a technique of rapid passage through varied ambiences. Okay. It is an unplanned journey through a landscape, usually urban, in which participants drop their everyday relations and let themselves be drawn by the attractions of the terrain and the encounters they find there. Uh, I mean, you can what they would say is you can do solo derives or you can do group derives. Yeah. So you work with the with your spontaneous impulses and you move with that through the city. Yeah. A little bit of a difference between performing derive as against a flaneur. Okay, a flaneur, which is a term which we have heard earlier, is usually denoting strolling, idling, and often with the connotation of wasting time. Okay, in a derive, a person is not really wasting time. In a derive, the person has a fundamental purpose of the derive itself. Yeah. You eliminate all the other purpose, but that you have to do the derive. Yeah. Another kind of an interesting proposition or a method that was invented was this idea of psychogeography that the situationists gave. You have to also remember, I'll come to that a little later. So, for example, in this case, mapping of atmospheric unity of a city on the basis of the letterist and situationist movement. Here is a map of Paris, which has been cut up in different areas that are experienced by some people as distinct unities or neighborhoods. Yeah. Uh, the mentally felt distance between these areas are visualized by spreading out the pieces of the cut up map. By wandering, letting oneself float or drift, each person can discover his or her own ambient kind of unities of specific city. Okay, so each person then is the imagination is that each person produces their own kind of psychogeographic map. Okay, and this could be a person's map where his city is actually built with these particular neighborhoods and their relationships based on time travel, based on comfort, based on many other factors. Okay, this is not a standard kind of operational map of the city that is produced by, say, planners or by others. This is what you call a psychogeographic map. Everybody produces a psychogeographic map in their head, and this is just one of the maps that is presented here. Yeah. So two very interesting methods: the derive and derive leading to the idea of psychogeography and psychogeographic mapping come from this situationist mode of operating. Okay. Little later, Guy Debord actually becomes also very important because he is constantly sort of interested in what is happening to social life in the city. And one of his most important works is a book called The Society of Spectacle, yeah, where Debord sort of examines this term spectacle for the everyday manifestation of capitalist driven phenomena, advertising, television, film, and celebrity. He says this is the spectacle. Yeah. He also defines it as the autocratic reign of market economy. Yeah. Though the term mass media is often used to describe spectacle's form, Debord derides its neutrality. Rather than talk of the spectacle, people often prefer to use the term media, he writes, and by this they mean to describe a mere instrument, a kind of public service. Instead, Debord describes the spectacle as capitalism's instrument for distracting and pacifying the masses. Fundamentally, that is the role of spectacle. Spectacle takes on many more forms today than it did during Debord's lifetime. It can be found on every screen that you look at. It is the advertisements plastered on the subway and pop-up ads that appear in your browser. It is the sort of listicle telling you 10 things you need to know about X. The spectacle reduces reality to an endless supply of commodifiable fragments while encouraging us to focus on appearances. For Debord, this constituted an unacceptable degradation of our lives. Yeah. All right. Uh, all of this kind of tension, this kind of frustration plays out in the protests of May 1968 in Paris. The unrest began with a series of students occupying occupation against capitalism, consumerism, American imperialism, and traditional institutions. Okay, but the protests grew much larger in France. It then eventually also got the labor sort of unions involved, almost sort of overthrowing the then French government. And this is a painting called The Protests of May 1968 by Jean Miro. Jin, are you there? Hi, Rohan. I don't think Jin.
I don't think Jin is there. I don't think Jin is there.
Jin is there. Okay, fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. She had something to say.
Yeah.
Okay. Simultaneously, we have to also understand that there is another kind of a tension that is that was always very apparent, but is now taking form. This is from a document compiled by Alison Smithson, which says emergence of Team 10 out of Siam. Okay, so there were a bunch of architects. Primarily coming from the Scandinavian nations, but some of them were actually from Italy and other places also, Spain as well, yeah, who basically fundamentally disagreed with the way the entire kind of Siam discourses were actually playing out. Okay, they were also some of the people who were very active in the early Siam sort of discussions, yeah. The participants were dissatisfied with the mid 20th century movement in 1959 when the conference happened under the theme Habitat. The younger members contested the simplistic division of living, working, leisure, and circulation that had been established in the Athens Charter. So they had fundamentally the problem with this simplistic division. Yeah, the members of Team 10 initially advocated the moral convictions of the early modern movement, but were contented with Siam's incapacity to respond to growth and change. Okay, so that was fundamentally the critique that they launched. Yeah, that this entire approach cannot actually look at growth and change. They felt that culture, climate, and context were not being addressed and opposed the modernist philosophy of tabula rasa. Okay, fundamentally disagreeing this idea of clearing and building anew. Okay, in the one of the most important kind of written works of the Team 10 is something called Team 10 Primer, and here is an abstract from there. I'm going to read that out. The 6 points. Yeah, one is to develop the road and communication system as the urban infrastructure, and to realize the implications of flow and movement in the architecture itself. Second is to accept the dispersal implied in the concept of mobility. Yeah, and to rethink accepted density patterns and location of functions in relationship to new means of communication. Yeah, so again, very clearly accepting that mobility will actually create a kind of a dispersal which needs to be checked in some way, to understand and use the possibility offered by throwaway technology. Yeah, to create new sort of environment with different cycles of change for different functions. So here the team 10 is already thinking about ways in which cycles of sustainability can be reimagined in the way we are thinking about how cities get built and planned. Yeah, to develop an aesthetic appropriate to mechanize building techniques and scales of operation, acknowledging that populations are going to grow and a scale of operation and a look at the scale of operation is essential to overcome the cultural obsolescence of most mass housing by finding solutions which project a genuinely 20th century technological image of dwelling, comfortable, safe, and not feudal. Again, the critique of modern kind of planning, housing, being this kind of banal repetition of housing units, cookie cutter stamps across Europe in the post-war reconstruction era, and to establish conditions not detrimental to mental health and well-being. So these were their fundamentals kind of principles. They went on to say a community should be built up from a hierarchy of associational elements and express those various levels of associations, which is the house, the district, and the city. It is important to realize that the term used, city, district, etc., are not to be taken as the reality, but as the idea, and that it is our task to find new equivalents for these forms of housing groups, streets, squares, and gardens, etc., as the social reality they presented no longer exists. Okay, so they are already basically saying that that idea of the street in a particular way is decadent. We have to look for new ways in which we are actually reimagining these ideas. Yeah, in the complex of associations that is a community, social cohesion can only be achieved if ease of movement is possible. And this provides us with our second law. Height or density should increase as the total population increases, and vice versa. In the context of a large city with high buildings, in order to keep ease of movement, we propose a multi-level city with residential streets in the air. Yeah. So there are some things which are still sort of familiar. So we are of the opinion that such a hierarchy of human associations should replace functional hierarchy of the Charter of Athens. Okay, so there are other things that to look at than the purely kind of functional hierarchy. Looking at communities, looking at neighborhoods, looking at the way in which different relationships can be made. Yeah, so this was a group of architects. These are all the names of the architects. Some of them we know very well, some we don't know very well, but we should definitely look at their other work. We know Aldo van Eyck. Jon was showing much of Aldo van Eyck's work in his presentation. We know Giancarlo De Carlo, and we know Ralph Erskine, and we know Rema Pietella. The others are not so well known, but definitely a point of curiosity for me for sure. Okay, now coming to some work that actually in some way is sort of taking on the challenge of the everyday and presenting a kind of a critique to the way we are actually imagining life and architecture. Yeah, so I'm going to look at Bernard Shumi's work. Just two things. We are going to look at the Manhattan Transcript, and we are going to look at Parc de la Villette as these two projects for us for the sake of the conversation. And our intention here is not to necessarily elaborate the details of the project, but to use the project as a way to think about this idea of everyday as being essential critique of the modern life. Yeah. So this is Manhattan Transcripts. I think we have it in the library. Not very easy to fathom in the first glance, but there's something that he's attempting to do. Yeah. So for Shumi, the transcripts are a device for analyzing the city. The transcripts are means of putting this experience on paper. Okay. Shumi calls this process transcription. He transcribes episodes of city experiences using photographs, architectural drawings, plans, diagrams, and axonometric projections. Okay, so he sees the sequence as part of the same kind of constellation. So the photographic image, the diagram, and the sort of object or the architectural kind of reference as a way to sort of create what he calls in some way a situation and experience. Yeah, they are a collection of architectural drawings that do not act as a completed proposal. That's not the intention. They hang between reality and fantasy. Shumi uses transcripts to make sense of an architectural reality that incorporates sequence, movement, and functionality. He focuses on using different mediums that portray different events and functions of a space, assessing unconventional strategies that occur in between the standard conclusions of architectural survey. Yeah, so that fundamentally is his intention. Okay, this is just some of the sort of pages from the Manhattan transcripts that he's, again, you're reading it in a particular way, right? You're reading it as a series of sequence, but between the bottom, middle, and the top line, you're also reading a new condition emerging. Yeah, so that intentionally is a sequence. Okay. In Parc de la Villette, okay, the project actually is a competition entry for which around about 400-500 sort of people had entered. His intention is very clearly to bring in a kind of what do you say, a grid, but it is not necessarily a grid that is made with streets and other elements that we understand the conventional grid. Okay, in some way it is a grid of support, you know. So for example, each of these, what he calls follies over here, hold certain kinds of sort of support functions within them, okay, that are necessary in order for us to actually enjoy the landscape around. Okay. Yeah, so that's the overall plan of the city, and this is where he plugs in those follies within the entire landscape of this site. Yeah, I'm just showing you some of the sort of overlays that are created. Okay, with these follies, he brings in a complete kind of a system by which you are able to then open the park and its experiences. Yeah, the system then also has many of these connector elements that you can use that support or sort of comfort the user, along with many of these entities. I have not seen this project, Rohan. I think you have been there, right? So you know this much better.
Yeah, I've been there.
Okay, we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
Later. Yeah. Okay, and these are the collection of the different follies that are actually inscribed within this larger kind of a urban landscape conglomeration is what I will call it. I am not very conversant with the follies, and so I will not pretend that I know, but I do know that these follies hold some of the support kind of infrastructure. Like there are toilets, there are cafes, there are ways to shield yourself from the harsh weather and things like that. Yeah. Sculptural, of course, all of them act as sculpture, and a collection of them inscribe a kind of a systemic reading in the user's mind, you know, because they are made in a certain way with a certain color, so they create references with each other. Of course, one of the critique of his project was also the kind of dehistoricizing the existing site, which had many of the older kind of industries and things like that. Okay, the second group of architects that I'm going to quickly talk about are Teddy Cruz and Fauna Forman. Very different time, very different time. They are far more contemporary. In fact, Teddy Cruz's and Fauna Foreman's practice actually begins only in 2005 or 2006, if I'm not wrong. Okay, they exist in an everyday which is very different. Okay, so here is the United States, San Diego, and here is Mexico, and this is a place called Tijuana. Okay, just look at, and that's the border right there that divides the two. Okay, so that's the nature of urban conglomeration on the bottom side, and on the upper side you see something very different. Okay, so this is Tijuana. Yeah, while large part of Tijuana seems to be gridded and planned, but internally it has internally within the block it has a logic which is completely organic, as you can see. Whereas on the San Diego side, not very far from Tijuana, are places like these. Okay, what happens between these? Every day, large amount of labor moves from Tijuana and enters into San Diego. They work as maids, they work as house helps, they work as daycare workers, they work as childcare givers in these houses. Okay, and every day labor comes back to Tijuana. Okay, and what does it do? Many a times they bring this with them. Yeah, entire homes, replicas of San Diego style ranch houses will be transported to Tijuana, where they are propped up on giant scaffoldings. Underneath is a room for business, parking, and more houses. You can see entire Levittowns that I showed you earlier completely recycled into a Tijuana slum. Yeah, this is the reality, or this is the everyday of this place. Yeah, to this uh, both Teddy Cruz and Fauna Foreman actually respond with a practice that is architecture plus graphic design plus kind of what do you say, exhibition sort of design, etc., etc. So, for example, here his main objective is to create graphics that convey issues beyond the scope of his architecture, reflecting political ideas or perhaps issues of homeland security also. For example, the image illustrates laboratories, which are the creation of individual units into systems. He asks what is the drama behind these images, but he also then creates the realities of this life, which is the 60-mile linear trans-border, which is called which he calls the urban conflict, and what happens on across this entire 60 miles on either side. Yeah, and the idea that the role of the architect here in particular is to also bring to the forefront some of the essential conflicts of our sort of large scale global ways in which operations happen, trade especially, and their realities to the everyday. Okay, so this is actually what he calls the political equator of the world, which he says actually passes through. Here there is Tijuana, here there is, I think, Yemen. Okay, this is passing through Iraq, this passes through Kashmir, and this goes somewhere else. Yeah, sorry, my phone is ringing for some reason. Okay, so he says that this is the kind of political equator where we are in, where on a regular basis there are migrations that happen from one part to the other, and material flows that go from one to the other as well. Okay, so there is a kind of a appropriation that is taken on, and now he has identified this isolated kind of a red line, which actually is the part from where labor gets extracted today. As you can see, he has now, in this recent adaptation, he has removed India from it. Yeah, India is now appropriating labor from other places as well. Yeah, so interesting that as a group of architects that are constantly thinking of their realities and their implications on the everyday from a much larger kind of point of view. Okay, again, another kind of a graphic representation of how materials actually material and labor actually flows from one side of the border to the other side of the border. What is borrowed and what is brought into this side, those houses, those tires and leftover kind of materials all come here and restructure life in this place. some of the projects that that they have done, and this is done with the University of San Diego, where they where instead of where the idea is to reverse some of these kind of tendencies, whereby whereby investment comes into community spaces in Tijuana, and create community spaces with investment coming from the University of San Diego, which is actually on the other side. Those are just some of the examples that I'm showing. And that's the kind of architecture that he imagines will be required for emergency housing conditions when you have when you can have a large scale sort of influx of immigrants and things like that, which for both Teddy Cruz and Fauna Foreman is a reality of their everyday living in Tijuana, where border extradictions can happen at any point of time. Yeah, so they imagine a framework that can then immediately house people and spaces and community kind of infrastructures. Yeah. In another example, they have negotiated with what are called maquiladoras. Maquiladoras are in fact factories that are set up inside of Mexico, okay, using the labor and production force from Mexico, but taking the product directly out into other nations that other nations that are actually buying them. Okay, so they are called maquiladoras, where they have been working with some of these factories that are into this kind of fabrication to in fact produce material in order to build spaces for the community there. So their practice very well sort of work very well, meaning they insist on working with community and their needs, and using some of the sort of advantages of the fact that you have these factories that are sort of simply exporting labor and taking on the other side, that some amount of things can be regenerated over here as well, improving life, for example. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to stop, guys.
Yeah. I'd never seen the Teddy Cruz work actually in detail.
Yeah, it's very fascinating actually. Yeah. And this idea that of course his studio is situated in Tijuana, and that gives them the added advantage of constantly engaging with communities there. But he's also very open and sort of what do you say?
You know, Shirish, you disappeared.
Sorry. Yeah. No, I'm saying I'll stop sharing for a while.
Yeah. You can stop sharing.
Okay. Yeah. He's also both of them are very aware that there is a kind of what do you say valorization of the slum and its commodities. You know, that commodification of the slum is a very real fact today. Architects love to build in the slum, given a chance where they don't have to negotiate with too many people, right? Okay, so he's fully aware that there is that tendency in his work.
But the romance,
the romance, yeah. But that is why a lot of, if you read his interviews, he insists that you can't just do architecture anymore. Okay, you have to actually you have to have a propaganda. You have to have many other ways of reaching out to the architecture community, so that you are able to explain your project not just as architecture that can be quickly consumed as a style, you know, because if you look at his work, it's tantalizing. Yeah, you can very well pick up that work without knowing what the reality of the process is behind, and that has to be elaborated. So that's Teddy Cruz. Okay.
No, it's also interesting when you look at the recent Pritzker Prize winners and their thing.
Yeah.
There is definitely a move away, I think. I mean, you know, I went to the Chicago Biennale where nostalgia was shown, and even the kinds of architects that we saw within that Biennale, it just may be interesting, I think, Shirish, one day for us to sit together and look at the kinds of practices that were showcased there. It was just a range of non-star architecture practices, you know, from across the world. It's an interesting turn. And if the Pritzker itself is beginning to acknowledge that, that shows that there is definitely, not just in our school, where we are presenting an apocalypse manifesto for ourselves, but I think there is a crisis within architectural circles around the world concerning what role they're playing actually. It's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah.
Anyway, do the kids have any questions, students? Any reactions to what Shirish said, Shirish showed, or anything that you want to add about the idea of the everyday? I mean, did you guys understand what the idea of the everyday effectively really is trying to do?
Yeah.
What is the threat? Why do you think that the idea of the everyday is seen as something that is new at all within architecture circles? Should we pick somebody to ask?
Yeah. Shrestha. Hi.
What was the question? Why do we think the idea of the everyday is?
I don't know. You think of a question. I have asked a question. You ask another question. You don't have to question my question.
No, but not related to the everyday itself. But earlier, when we were talking about letterism and looking at poetry, I remember like when we were doing research for Walt Whitman for our blog posts, I came across letterism, and they were talking about how the way he prints his books itself is kind of a reflection on his fascination with the skyline of Manhattan and how he sort of thought of it like a brand name made up of his buildings. So like it was about the change. A lot of his work has a change in the margins when he's writing, and it was maybe they were talking about how it could be a comment on the change in the waterfront of Manhattan itself because of erosions or landfills, and even he did not like much open space in his work, and he's like been vocally critical about how Manhattan should develop vertically and not horizontally, and he didn't like those roles. And it's just interesting. It does sound like a bit of a reach, like a 12th grade English teacher, like kind of, interpreting and adding extra meaning to everything. But it's also kind of interesting to see how letterism acts as kind of a bridge between poetry and urban planning.
Yeah, it's a nice thing to think about, poetry and urban planning together. Something that urban planners have very often, in fact, that is actually one of the main things that I think the situationists, like how Shirish explained them, were really interested in. They were like, ये सब ये modernist लोग हैं ना, Corbusier, Corbusier, वो top down देखते हैं, ऊपर से देखते हैं. In fact, I would say situationists are one of the first people who are really talking about bottom up imaginations of urbanism. Huh? So they say कि ये सब, in fact, वो बोलते हैं कि ये सब top down जो है ना, you're able to only see geometries in a plan. Okay? And the idea of like the situationist is like, situation क्या होता है? Situation is a place where you're suddenly in a particular time and place doing a certain thing with your body, speaking. Situation आ गया. What Bernard Schumi in his book calls the event. The event. Now the event is a place where together like kuch hua. And what he saying, I think the situation is also saying, is that jo hota ko hota hai. I feel it, I can hear it, I can remember it, and there is a beauty to that presence. When I'm here and I'm like this, the sunlight outside, and I'm listening to you, and I can hear the kitchen mein kuch mukul bana raha hai. There's a certain presence to my world, a certain experience to my world, a certain phenomenological, that word if you remember from earlier, a phenomenological presence to me, that sometimes these architects and these planners, when they are imagining cities, they tend to forget entirely. Ki my memory, my history, my mythology, my stories, my presence, my smell I have, those are things that just don't exist within the imagination of the architects and the urban planners. So what the situationists are really trying to do is that they are trying to kind of bring back the body. Like when you go on a derive, na, ye derive that Shirish spoke about. Derive kya hai? Derive hai ki drift. The word means drift in French, I think.
Yeah.
So what they are asking you to do is just like get out of the home, okay, and just drift. Let your senses take you where you want them to. Let not your mind determine where you're going only, but let your senses tell you where your mind wants to take you. The city in your mind through what the senses are telling you that the city is. So even the maps are actually these fragments that come together. There's no overall map at all. There's only a
Rohan, did we lose him? Hey, Rohan. We lost you.
Internet gaya.
He's okay. Rohan, we lost you in between.
I'm back.
Okay.
Am I back? Can
Yes,
you
you're
hear
back.
me?
Yeah.
Okay. So he has these three ways in which he says you can conceptualize a city. One is the concept of a city, which is in your mind. Okay. Then the second thing he says the city as it's built, okay, as it is realized. And the third way is he says in the which the city is lived. Right? So all these three, he says, are different kinds of approaches to a particular moment. Like for example, if I think about how I imagine the city, then it's something that's in my head. If I look at the way that the city that I live in is the city that is built, okay, the buildings, etc. And the third, the way that I live within a city, negotiate the space between the lived and what's in my mind, memory, desire, all of these, things that determine what I call good, bad, value systems, all of these in my mind. So what the derive does actually, and in my head, what the derive does is that it locates all of these within that moment of the body's experience. And for me, when Shirish is showing Shumi, okay, for me, Shumi's project is actually a collapse of these three imaginations that Lefebvre suggests. The conceptual is the grid, okay, the grid for 40 meters by 40 meters, I believe.
Yeah.
That is then laid upon that entire park. So it's completely an abstract grid. No one has ever seen it. Only people who will see it in a drawing will see that grid. No one else ever knows. For me, the second, the realized city are those red cubes. Those red cubes that actually dhad, relentlessly just mark the kind of corners, okay, of that grid. And then what he does is that he allows what the site is, the ecology of the site, the activities of the site, the everyday life, in other words, of the site, to begin to distort and sculpt those red cuboids. Okay. So what he tries to do, successfully, unsuccessfully, is another matter. But what he tries to do is that he tries to bring back the body, the event, as a moment of intersection between these different conceptions of being in the world. And I find that like a kind of, I mean, as somebody who's, as somebody who has, if there's one philosopher that I absolutely love to read, it is Lefebvre. I mean, I love his language. I have all his books. I'm quite like, as you say, I'm a fanboy. There is such a beauty to the way that he imagines living in the world, walking through things, seeing things. There's a soft gentleness through which he imagines the relationship between social structure, nature, and experience. And the collapse of all of these, he treats with such gentleness and such precision that I think there is such a beauty to the way that one can imagine the idea of living. And as an architect, when we make our drawings and when we make our buildings, we keep telling you guys, now walk through your building. When we are saying walk through your building, we mean that we want to place yourselves as bodies within those spaces, and we want to make sure that every single moment that anybody has within your projects is one that is suffused with joy, with pleasure of being alive, of the pleasure of the conversation, the pleasure of light and shadow, the pleasure of heat, noise, whispers, all of the above. And I think that's what, for me, the concept of the everyday allows us to see. It allows us to see us as just plain, simple, alive. Rather than some sort of AutoCAD पे जो human figure बनाते हैं ना लोग, outlines.
Yeah.
Anyone else wants to kind of respond? What should we pick?
We should maybe pick one more person, Shrestha, somebody else. Risha, you have to.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like we had, I think in Sem 5 also we had Bernard Shumi as our I don't remember it that. I think we had some of his uh, templates to kind of start off with as our design project. So we were
Ah,
like, so the way you explained the sketches that you showed about him was actually very similar to the way we actually. Um,
no, you're right. You're right. Just continue. You're
Hmm.
absolutely right.
so the way you explained that how his design project process was, so I think we also kind of experienced the way we, according to his sketches that he actually saw in his everyday life, we also kind of caught up in that process and started designing in terms.
Yeah. Shirish, you know the process now we had for the first semester project?
No, I don't.
Oh,
I
it was
don't.
very interesting. So there's a book. It's actually absolutely amazing to discuss that. Glad you brought that up, Risha. It's a book that I highly recommend. It's a graphic novel called The Walking Man.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Of course I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I know.
And
I
we
know
took
the
three
process.
images
Now I
off
remember.
though, right?
Yeah,
And that time, and they had to locate that,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
each of them
Yeah.
was an event. Huh?
I see. So you use the Shumi's method as a way to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was also thinking that the examples that you gave were like, I was thinking in terms of an Indian architect who actually designs for this everyday life. But
Hmm.
I I don't know, I don't know who can actually fit in that category that has been discussed today as well.
Good point,
So
actually. I think if you ask me, there are a few. I think both Doshi and Korea tend to romanticize a particular kind of Indian life in the way that they design. In according to me, and this may be a purely personal preference, I think Korea's work manages to do it better than Doshi's does. Especially because he really looks at how people are going to his text, that book, that the new landscape, it very clearly talks about the fact that people are going to change, people are going to live lives, and we need to make an architecture that can change. That is pretty much what the new landscape text is about. But then again, I do tend to kind of favor the Korea texts substantially more, just because maybe my own history and being from Bombay.
Yeah.
can Baker be also considered as a person who used to design for an everyday?
I do maybe I've never been to a Baker building. Shirish, have you?
No, I have not been to a Baker building, but I think yes, Baker also.
Yeah.
Yeah, would be that person. Uh, I also have this. See, for example, if you build a house for someone, like, everybody has the desire to change. Okay, nothing is permanent. Yeah, and I find this idea that architecture also defined under this scale of permanence a little bit difficult. Like for example, although for example, I'll give you an example. Okay, Doshi would come every week twice to Sept early in the morning at 5 o'clock to take pictures of the building. Okay, and he would be most amused if we had done something to the building. Okay, if something was hanging from somewhere, if somebody had created a cantilever cable that went out and a whole thing. Okay, he was most interested in the way you were inhabiting and making changes to that space. All right, so on contrary to another architect being like, what is this, this is damaging the building, this is doing xyz to the building, that question was never there. That question has come up except now. Okay,
Yeah.
we treated the building and its material as our own. We did whatever we want with that building, quite literally. and one time creating a cantilever extension with a new seating, and another time pasting whatever posters. Okay, you could talk about the nature of that poster, but that question that the poster damages the wall was never there. Okay, so I think sensitive architects are fully aware of this fact that people want change, and how do you create an architecture that allows that?
But I must say that although I said that all those beautiful things about Korea, Korea was a real pain when it came to transformation buildings.
Yeah,
He hated
absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
He hated it. Or what he said and what he did belong to sometimes two different worlds.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think it also comes from the way that architecture is taught, Shirish. We are taught to make that drawing as an artifact, you know? And that in the drawing, there is always a sense of like finish or completeness that is necessary. It's part of the way in which degrees are given. You know, that's the unfortunate fact of this. I mean, I don't know if a thesis project does what Lacaton and Vassal did, which is just say, we don't need to do shit. Let's just change a pavement here. You know, I don't think that student would pass.
Yeah, I found, but Rohan, Bhagyaratna's thesis was very interesting, because it looked at that kind of transience in housing for those for the laborers. I found, of course, I mean, he would draw things also in a particular way. I found his thesis. I don't know if these guys know about Bhagyaratna and his thesis, but
don't know who Bhagya is.
So 2 years ago, I remember seeing his jury. Rohit and somebody else were on the jury, and I remember that discussion coming up as to the idea of permanence and impermanence when it comes to this life of.
No, I can tell you, Shirish, I have this one student called Amruta Hargekar, and there's a huge ass building that has been built outside Belgaum. It's a replica of the Vidhan Sauda. It has no relationship with anything, and it's literally in the middle of fields. Okay, so her project is obviously trying to reimagine what that can be. In some ways, it can just be an interior design project if you look at the building. Okay, but I know if I allow her to go ahead with an interior design project, you know, there's no way that she's kind of being able to kind of go through the bachelor's of architecture course. Right? So then to be able to, because she has to perform a skill. Perform a skill means you have to demonstrate through the building. You know, but because I mean, obviously she's not interacting with any communities there because it's the thesis. She's here. So you have that problem within architecture itself, I think, as a discipline, that tends to think that architecture is the design of buildings. Not necessarily the reconfiguration of space or whatever material.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, I was just telling you, in the morning, we were just discussing in the morning that, you know, in Japan, the population is decreasing and there's a lot of architecture that's lying empty. Yet, most Japanese architects are building these beautiful, beautiful houses. And I'm thinking, yeah, actually, the sustainable thing to do would be to just, you know, go and live in those empty houses or find ways to kind of adaptive reuse those empty houses. But yet, that is not what we tend to valorize within architecture circles. We tend to valorize a beautiful building.
Yeah.
How beautiful they are.
This idea of repurposing.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah. Anyone else?
Let's pick Yash Mehta. Chal, CR.
Yash Mehta. Okay.
Yeah, like Yash Parth Patel. Sorry. Why
Parth.
made him Yash Mehta? I don't know. Then Parth, whatever. Parth Mehta.
Parth Mehta.
I think they're all interchangeable words. Yash, Parth, Mehta, Patel.
No. Parth, please say something before Rohan continues. Please say something. Parth,
politically incorrect.
We need you. Yeah. I don't think Parth is there. Parth, are you there?
He must have just turned it on and like gone away.
Maybe.
Yeah. Or koi?
Okay. What about Ananya? Okay, what about Ananya? Hi.
Hi, yeah, could you hear me?
I think Sarthak had his hand up also.
Okay, but let Ananya speak now.
Yeah, first Ananya.
I think what you spoke about, how important it is for the architect to actually understand how important the spaces that they build are after people start living in them. That point, like, I mean, it really appealed to me. And even like in the beginning, when you were quoting Lefebvre's the first the book, The Critique of Everyday Life, when he spoke about how the land that you look at is actually something that's been toiled on by many people for many years. So I think that really appealed to me, because we always like have all these imaginations of how this is how my building is going to be after I build it, and these are all the crazy social like changes that I'm going to do. But the reality and how Doshi actually went to his building, so things like that, I mean, really appeal to me, because, and I think that is so important like as architects, because we end up I mean, like, maybe a lot of us consider that, okay, once the project is built, that is the end of our sort of role in it. So I think the idea of revisiting the structures that we've built and seeing how people are actually using them, living in them. So yeah, that really appealed to me.
Yeah. I found that first text very fascinating. Sorry, go ahead, Sarthak.
Yeah, hello. Rohan, do you remember I was doing something like this in semester 5, like looking at events and the body inhabiting it?
Yes, I remember.
So,
I remember
like
very
constantly while dealing with that idea, yeah, like constantly dealing with that idea, like trying to create the space graceful. I was confused, like what am I doing? Like I was not sure about, like, if people will like would they even bother looking it through what I'm like through the lens I'm looking it through. Like why would anyone consider a everyday thing as a concept? Or there were many controversies uh, like
controversy. That's the wonderful thing. What has happened, Sarthak, is that as architects, we've been led to believe that our interest is in making of buildings, when actually what we are really doing is making spaces where opportunities can exist for interaction. That's what we do. I'm like, when Shirish is sitting there, he's making use of a space that was created for actually something else entirely. But his body is inhabiting that space. It's doing what it has to because it's making space. His body is not only inhabiting space, his body is involved in the making of space. What Lefebvre calls the production of space. He says space is produced. Remember this. He doesn't say space is inhabited. He says space is produced in three ways. It is imagined, it is built, and it is lived. And as you're living, you're producing space. This is what Lefebvre says. So even within your project, if you had the sort of rigor and integrity and not been so scared of it, if you just followed that story down, maybe something new would have emerged. Maybe the building did not have to do juggling around. Maybe it just had to be one simple space with no, like a dabba. Maybe that was also fine. Maybe, I don't know. But I think that idea that one should be able to make a space that bodies can really perform actions in and be free with is something that I think is an interesting thing to think about generally. But you're absolutely right. That was one of the kind of complications as far as that project was concerned. Is how does one evolve a process that is able to talk about form through inhabited bodies, by inhabiting bodies? And frankly, it's very tough. That's why I think I pushed you towards looking at Shumi as well. Did I or did I not?
yes, right.
Yeah, because Shumi tries to do that. He tries to evolve a process which is looking at the body as the generator of architecture. I think Mohit also had his hand up.
Mohit?
Yeah, I was thinking about this designing for everyday and how a building actually starts getting used by people, like when they actually start inhabiting the space, not just using it. The other day when I was driving back from Thane, I saw this really weird building. It looked like a building from Studio Ghibli movies, like it's like this narrow at the bottom and then broad at the top, and
Wait.
all these. I think Powai or Thane, somewhere in that
Yeah.
area, and like I saw all these clothes hanging from each and every window, and that's when you realize, okay, that building is actually being used. It's actually, and I started thinking in that manner, like when you look at a building and you start looking at these clothes being dried outside, you start thinking, okay, that's like a home. People
Yeah.
actually inhabiting that space. And then when you look at some
Yeah.
other buildings, like an office building with curtain walls and all, and you just feel like, okay, that's more formal, like that's completely in a different this thing. And like ironically, I even looked at some of Stephen Hall's videos. Like Stephen Hall, like I think even he works from like this bottom to top sort of manner. Like he doesn't have his own language as per, even in his books he himself mentions that he doesn't try to find his own language, but he tries to find the language of the site itself, like what the people want to live in, how do they want to inhabit that particular space. So
Mm.
I thought this kind of connected to that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you bring Stephen Hall up, yeah, because like Stephen Hall's work, he's. I mean, you're absolutely right. He's also really interested in inhabiting bodies, like bodies that are living. But the way that Stephen Hall imagines them, in Stephen Hall's imagination, these bodies are feeling bodies. They feel huh? Light and shadow and silence and all of these.
Yeah.
But they are not the bodies that hang underwear on their clothes line. Those are like for me, Stephen Hall's bodies are little like very deep and very profound bodies, meditative bodies. They are bodies they are experiencing, but they are experiencing things like they are some sort of sant. But they are not like normal everyday life bodies. नहीं है वो जो general लोग रहते हैं ना कि हम
Hmm.
who are not meditating deeply on things, are actually listening to music on their iPods,
Yeah.
wondering what they're going to text next to their boyfriends. It's not that. That's not the body of a Stephen Hall. That may be, like Shirish is pointing out, Lucian Kroll's work. Um, so I think it's an interesting thing to think about, like the way that the body itself is conceptualized by architects themselves. When I think about, like, if I ask you, what kind of body would a Mies van der Rohe building want?
Hmm.
And you can only imagine some sort of apparition of a body, na? Like anything that
Skeletal.
some skeletal, like empty outline of a body. No, you can't imagine somebody wearing kind of, let's say, I don't know, Mickey Mouse underpants walking around in those buildings. So it's not that kind of building, na? It's a sort of pure space, like सूट पहना होगा या कुछ पहना भी नहीं होगा, नेकेड चल सकता है, लेकिन nothing tacky in a Stephen Hall building, in a Mies van der Rohe building. And then I wonder about the same when I think about a Frank Lloyd Wright building, like a Roby House or something like that. What kind of home, what kind of body would be inhabiting there? And I can only imagine another sort of like this sort of muscularity that's there as far as those buildings are concerned.
Yeah, the broadness to it.
It's interesting. I was just like, it's a game I used to play once. Like, what kind of body? I know there was a whole course I had developed. I think that was my first theory of design course I ever developed for KRVI. Was about homes actually, and we had done the whole thing through what were the imagined bodies for architecture. Whose body inhabits Villa Savoy? Like. And actually, when you start discovering the body or talking about the body, India, you automatically come up with questions of gender and sexuality and of course caste. So that is also another kind of layer that becomes quite an interesting layer through which you can really examine the architecture itself. Like whose body is seen as the valid body for this architecture? What kind of family, for God's sake, what kind of boy, what kind of woman, what kind of child?
For that, you'd need categorizations for the body, right? Which would not be politically correct.
That's the problem, no? But do you agree? This is a question for everyone. Do you agree that every time you design a building, in your mind there is a body that is inhabiting it?
Yeah.
Yeah, we always imagine a user, like some we have.
Yeah, a user is not a body. A user is a user, like the number, na? Do you imagine yourself in the spaces, or do you imagine somebody else when you design, let's say, I don't know, a lobby space? Mohit?
Yeah, never thought of it that way.
Yeah, it's the question of empathy. That's the one. Is when I asked that purposefully annoying question to Ajinkya the other day at the thing, like ऐसी कीड़ा करने के लिए, who what was that question I asked? I've forgotten, but anyway, who speaks for whom? Part of it was that is to kind of start thinking about कि as I'm a designer and I'm always in many ways as an architect designing, at some level my value systems are deeply embedded in what I'm drawing. But yet, as I'm drawing, I still claim that I'm doing it for somebody else. So how do I begin to, like my bodily experience, how do I mirror it in that other person's bodily experience? Can't be done actually. But we have to do something in our heads. Some sort of transference has to happen. Otherwise, there is no reason for architecture to exist. So I think in the everyday, there is that entire idea of inhabitation, living. What does it mean to be somebody else? What does it mean to kind of stay alive as somebody else? As an individual, I genuinely believe in the power of community, and genuinely believe that people want to kind of give and connect, be part of society, social structures. And there's a generosity involved with that. So when I think about the everyday as a space, I like that idea because it is a little non-judgmental. Like people do things, man, get up and that's a place we all have fundamental basic needs, that to communicate, to speak, to eat, to enjoy music. Stuff that may not appear to be very profound and deep, like meditative, like I'm getting spiritually uplifted and all, maybe may not be happening. Okay, but I think there can be great spiritual upliftment in a fantastic cup of coffee too. So what the everyday really does is that it brings the stuff of everyday life into the place of beauty. Things that we take for granted. Shirish is that lovely orange shirt with that black and white background at the back. It's beautiful. There's something stunning about the light that is hitting the back, right over there. It allows you to take pleasure in the world that we inhabit without pre-thinking it, without judging oneself. It allows us to love BTS and Bach at the same time. You don't need to make a decision. If you love it and you enjoy it, it is what it is. That's what the everyday allows us to do. It allows you to see the world and embrace the world with all its complexity and with a great deal of generosity. And that, I think, is how empathy is built. How one begins to inhabit somebody else. Okay. So I think.
All right. Anyone else? There's an important piece of notice that I should give everyone. You have to write a paper. You have promised. Okay.
On one of these terms.
Me and Janila were just thinking that I think we'll set up an assignment in teams. Okay. Let's start seeing some of the things that you're writing.
So let me say this. They have, by in next week's class, they have to tell us. Are they doing it individually or are they doing it in twos?
They are doing it individually, this one.
Okay, so then individually in the next week's class, we need to have everybody tell us what is the term out of that circle that Shirish has shown that they are choosing to write their papers on. Is this clear?
Yeah. Yes, everyone, we have to grade you guys. Last time, we just passed you. By the way,
I know, with shit work.
Frankly speaking.
Vallabhi, did you hear this? I like the fact that I picked a random person who's definitely not there.
It's going in air somewhere.
Yeah, I heard.
Oh my God, I'm so happy. Did you hear? Will you have what you're going to be writing on for the next in the next class?
No, for the next, we'll set up an assignment. You will write a 150-word abstract on the paper that you're going to write, explaining which of these ideas you're going to use to actually look at your own project. That's the assignment, right?
No, they have to take the term and they have to write an essay on it, na?
Okay, fine.
Or they have to look at their own projects through
I
it.
thought they'd look at their own project through that lens.
That'll be fun. That'll be fun. Yes, let's let them do that. Very good. Very good.
Let's look at your own project through that lens.
And the project that they've done in 6th semester or 5th semester, either of those.
Either of them, you can pick.
Oh, there's a question. There's a question, no, Shiru?
Been sitting on this question for weeks. Some from the Frampton reading, the in order to has become content of the for the sake of utility establish as meaning generates meaningless. Rohan has briefly talked about it, but I couldn't really understand. Okay, Rohan, I don't think Rohan has any idea of what he spoke about in the context of what right now.
Completely forgotten.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
So
the in order to has become content of the for the sake of. Sorry, I can't really remember. I'll have to read the essay again. Can you contextualize that sentence for me within the essay? It's like 3 sentences before and after.
Should I like give the reading or should I just talk about what the thing was?
You can talk also.
You can talk also.
Yeah, so it was basically talking about this cultural effect of industrialization. So because there was industrialization, people were losing out on culture, and when this sort of thing about like not able to explain it either very well, but maybe should I just try reading it?
Yeah, just try reading it. Let's see that. Yeah. Maybe we could one day, Shirish, just do a discussion class. Like that we do like, okay, blank. They are allowed to ask us. We get 3 people to ask us. They can curate the questions. Everyone gives them the questions and they decide what they want to ask and not ask. And it's anonymous, so they can ask anything. Is that fine?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I'll just like read that last paragraph. Ever since the beginning of enlightenment, civilization has been primarily concerned with the instrumental reason, while culture has addressed itself to the specifics of expression, to the realization of the being and the evolution of its collective psycho-social reality. Today's civilization tends to be increasingly embroiled in a never-ending chain of means and ends, wherein, according to Hannah Arendt, the in order to has become the content of the for sake of utility established as meaning generates meaninglessness.
Staff room is open.
Okay, so this is very simply his critique of form follows function. That's what it is actually. Where he's saying that there is a sort of way in which meaning is generated purely because we need to do this because of. So there is a sort of instrumentalist. Instrumentalist is like, you know what an instrument is. Na? You use a spoon to eat. So architecture only becomes merely something that you have to do something else. So he's saying that very imagination of an instrumentalist idea of architecture, which is form follows function, in other words, is something that has completely kind of sapped the role that architecture can play within the world. That's fundamentally what he's saying. Is this clearer?
Yeah. You were giving like a example last time also, but I tried going through the recording a couple of times, but like I couldn't get it. I think this gives a better, clearer idea.
Yeah. Fundamentally, I mean, you can read it again, but I think it is primarily a critique of form follows function. Because modernism really took that as literally it's mantra, na? We are rationalist people. We don't do wasteful things. We only do efficient things. All of the above, right? So we only need this in order to.
Right.
Yeah. It's his critique of that. And then on the other hand, there is the other one, which is where he says that there is like a sort of way in which the aesthetic has been reduced down to SH. The aesthetic itself has no instrumentalist role. So what he's trying to do is trying to critique both form follows function and the idea of the aesthetic as something that is only cultural and has no other purpose. So he's critiquing both of those and trying to say that what we need to do is evolve a tectonic strategies that can combine both the cultural as well as the, I guess, the programmatic.
Right.
There's another comment.
Something to do with Luciel Kroll's work.
I can't read it, so just what is
Wait
it?
a second. I have too many windows open.
No, I deleted that comment. I was gonna say, looking at Lucian Kroll's work, doesn't it also remind you of Collage House by S plus PS Architects?
Yeah, but yeah, to some extent you're right. There's some.
Yeah, but you're only looking at it.
Yeah, only by the looks of
You're
it.
only looking at it. You should look at the you should look at their process, okay, and how they are and by the way, Luciel Kroll very rarely did houses for individuals. It was always housing, meaning a collective. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
It looked damn interesting. Like I really
Very
liked his
Really
houses. Yeah.
he said, he used to say one thing very clearly: no client, meaning he needs somebody he has to work with. Like he would not do work for developers at any point of time. His entire critique was on mass produced housing. Yeah, anyways.
Wait, if his entire critique was on mass produced housing, then even what he did was
cookie cutter mass produced housing.
Okay, like that. Yeah.
Which is
Yeah. He had this. You're looking at the I think it's a hostel, isn't it?
It's a hostel. He's looking at the hostel.
Yeah. A nice project. I don't know.
The very first image that comes up when you Google Lucian Kroll, that one, and then even the diagram next to it, it looks damn interesting.
No, but even S plus PS, that entire process of building the collage house is an interesting process to think about when you are looking at. There are two very different things. One is the aesthetic of the collage, which is very much part of the collages houses mode. But if you look at how the building was itself built, the client was deeply involved with the sourcing of the windows and the doors, etc. But it continued to stay the facade of one person's house. So it was that one person's desire to present a sort of collage as a facade, While for Lucian Kroll's work, what you find is that there is a way in which communities or families themselves are choosing how they would like their homes to be. So it's a variety of different sorts of clients, and what he's doing is developing a process so that a variety of different people can then choose the modes through which they want to live. So there is, although aesthetically they both may seem similar, the processes in some ways are fundamentally different.
Yeah.
It's an important, but it's a very good kind of point that you raised. It's like, because what happens often is that we mistake the aesthetic for very often the process, especially when it comes to questions of the informal, etc. The informal aesthetic itself has become kind of cool nowadays. It's kind of cool to have. There's a coolness factor that's very much part of the way. I mean, I know friends of mine, very close friends actually. They call themselves Bard Studio nowadays. Is that their entire kind of career is built on the romanticization of the informal, where they make these really beautiful things that come from the informal world. But even I think about the same thing, about the real role of the aestheticization of the informal that they do, and what real sort of what does it really imply? What does it imply for the class of architects that we belong to, from us middle class architects? Why do we romanticize the aesthetic of the slum? What is it that we get from that kind of aesthetic that the world that we inhabit doesn't offer us? And for me, and to come back to what Shirish's talk was today about, for me, what it does is that it really reconnects us to what we think we've often lost connection with, the world of the everyday. Within our middle class lives, this thing that we think that we are living in some sort of cookie cutter way, living in a sort of very straightforward, hegemonic sort of way, whatever we may call it. But what the aesthetic of that does seem to do is that it in some sense offers us the romance of life. Oh, look how wonderful these people are. Look at these beautiful things that they do. That full language happens, that we very easily claim. For me, the kind of aesthetic really offers us that. But I don't know, that's another conversation maybe. maybe we'll come back to that when we are discussing the subaltern.
Yeah. In Collage House, it is only that particular facade which is like that.
Yes.
Yeah. Otherwise, the spaces are structured
Yeah,
as
yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah, I
it's
realize.
very,
Yeah,
very
it's just
different.
like from the front. Yeah, but the fundamentals of each product is like both of them are different. It also reminded me of Alejandro Aravena's work where he builds in Chile, where he had to rebuild like a slum. But what he does is he makes half a house, and like
Yeah, that's
lets
his
people.
incremental
Yeah,
kind of strategies where he lets people. So the two walls are already constructed. So the
yeah,
in-between house costs much lesser. Yeah, and
yeah,
then the in-between house gets built with very different materials if you want it.
yeah. And each house is different because people themselves who
Each
inhabit those
structure.
houses,
Yeah.
yeah.
But that is not, I mean, to be blunt, that's not particularly innovative as far as architecture.
I mean, it's not particularly innovative, but given given that there is a kind of a developer who you have worked with who is allowing you to do that, that's interesting. I find.
Is it the developer or the state?
I don't know. In that case, it was a
Because
developer.
if the state, and in terms of Korea's work, whether that's the artist village, okay, that's pretty much their entire project was built in the mid 70s to the 80s with exactly the same concept, But of course, the aesthetic was very different. What I think is that part of Aravena's entire kind of sex appeal is the aesthetic of the architecture. I mean, I think it's great work. Please let's not get me wrong as far as that is concerned. But yeah, there are lots of people who've tried to, in many ways, destabilize architecture to point to be able to engage with the transformations that happen in everyday life. But yeah, you're right. Aravena is also a very important example of this sort of. And I think now, given the way that architecture culture seems to be moving, we are seeing a definite move away from star architects. Definite move away from the big object as the architectural project. Across, I mean, from the Biennales to the Pritzkers, you're seeing that change. I mean, Doshi winning a Pritzker is actually more to do with that change than it has to do anything with the real tectonic quality of his work, if you ask me. That wasn't so when Zaha Hadid won. Anyway, chal, that's all for today, I think.
Okay, all right.
Let's kind of